Okay, so welcome everybody to Module 9, where we are going to be discussing the blood. So these next two chapters that we're going to get into is going to focus on the two kind of major components of the circulatory system. So the circulatory system has your uh, heart and blood vessels, and then the blood that is pumped through the circulatory system. Um, and in chapter 7, we're going to focus on blood. We're going to focus on the components of blood, what kind of regulates the amount of blood that we have in our body. And then we'll talk about where blood cells are made and kind of where they come from in our body. And so to start out with in this first video for the module, we're going to really just kind of look at an overview of the circulatory system. Like we mentioned, or like I just mentioned, the circulatory system is made up of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. So the heart is basically the pump that helps to kind of move the blood around the body. The blood vessels, you can think of the highway or the transport system for the blood. And then the blood is made up of a lot of different material: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, water. And so all of that together is transported throughout the body. And there are a lot of dissolved contents that are also in the blood, like ions, oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc., that are transported throughout the body as well. And so that blood is that mixture of kind of all of those different substances. And we'll talk all about those substances throughout chapter 7 and chapter 8. Now, the blood is really important, or the circulatory system, I guess you could say, is really important for picking up the nutrients, right, that come from the digestive system. It exchanges gases with the respiratory system. And it also carries waste to the urinary system and excess water, right? So the urinary system will kind of get rid of that. Nutrients and oxygen will be delivered to every cell in the body via the circulatory system and the blood. And then the products of cellular respiration, which one of those is CO2, will be transported to the respiratory system, the lungs, for removal from the body. And then there are also metabolic wastes, so other products that are made during the process of metabolism that will be transported to the liver so that it can be safely discarded from the body as well. And so not only does the blood interact with all of these other organ systems, so the digestive system, the respiratory system, the urinary system, one of the accessory organs of the digestive system, which is the liver. But it also helps to regulate body temperature. So blood is really important for regulating body temperature. And we briefly talked about this a little bit already in a previous chapter. But basically, the blood vessels can constrict and dilate depending on whether or not the person is hot or cold. If they're cold, the blood vessels will constrict to keep that warmth within the body. And then if they're hot, the blood vessels will dilate to allow the blood to run very close to the surface of the skin so that that heat can dissipate into the atmosphere. And so the circulatory system is very important. And is a lot and serves and interacts with a lot of different organ systems. So here's a figure of kind of all of the different interactions for the circulatory system. You see where it interacts with the respiratory system with exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, the urinary system for those waste that eliminates from the body, the digestive system where it brings in nutrients, but it also gets rid of metabolic waste. And then it transports all of those things to the different cells. And so, again, the circulatory system is interacting with several different organ systems constantly throughout the body. And in order to kind of understand how the circulatory system works and functions and actually accomplishes all of these, we need to take some of our knowledge from chemistry chapter, from the cell chapter, and our tissue chapter. And we're going to bring up a lot of the things that we've talked about already and look at how that's important in allowing the circulatory system to kind of do all of these things in the body. Now, the component we're going to talk about in chapter 7 specifically is the blood. And so, like we mentioned in our tissues chapter, blood is in fact a connective tissue. It's a specialized connective tissue, and it consists of specialized cells, so like your red blood cells and your white blood cells, but also cell fragments. So, for example, like your platelets. But it also is made up of water, and that water has ions and other molecules that are dissolved and inside of that watery solution. And the blood has 3 primary functions that actually is part of the functions of the circulatory system. So it's that homeostasis, so the regulation of temperature. And not only is it temperature, but it's water volume and pH. It's important for transporting nutrients, waste, and also hormones throughout the body. Remember, we said those endocrine glands, the endocrine glands, release hormones or substances directly into the bloodstream. And so the blood is important for transporting those hormones. And the blood also helps to defend against infections and also helps to reduce the amount of bleeding, as long as you have the appropriate proteins and clotting factors that are supposed to be present in your blood. And we'll talk about what can happen if you don't have some of those. And one of those consequences is what's known as hemophilia. And we'll talk about that briefly towards the end of this chapter. All right, and so before we get into kind of the composition of the blood, let's just watch this little animation that's kind of going to go over some of that, and then we'll go over it again in a little bit more detail.
Blood is a specialized connective tissue consisting of specialized cells and cell fragments suspended in an aqueous solution containing molecules and ions. Blood carries out 3 vital functions in the body: transport, regulation, and defense. Plasma, which makes up about 55% of blood volume, is the liquid element of blood. It is 90% water and contains dissolved ions, proteins, hormones, gases, nutrients, and wastes. Plasma serves as the transport medium for the cellular and non-cellular elements of blood. An important group of non-cellular elements are the plasma proteins. Plasma proteins include albumins, globulins, and clotting proteins. Albumins help to maintain osmotic balance and assist in the transport of biomolecules and drugs. There are 3 classes of globulins: alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha globulins are important in the transport of thyroxine, the precursor to active thyroid hormone, and vitamin A. Beta globulins bind to lipid molecules such as cholesterol. Gamma globulins are important in immunological responses. Clotting proteins are necessary for minimizing blood loss at wound sites. Platelets are small fragments of megakaryocytes, derivative of stem cells in bone marrow. They play an important role in wound repair. The first step following vessel injury is vascular spasm. The injured vessel contracts, reducing blood flow. Platelets in the blood near the wound swell and develop sticky extensions. They adhere to each other and to the wall of the wounded vessel, forming a platelet plug. Clotting proteins in the plasma form an insoluble mesh, thereby forming a blood clot. Hemophiliacs have low levels or complete absence of clotting proteins in their plasma. Cuts and bruises become life-threatening without prompt medical treatment. The most common treatment is injection of a clotting protein called clotting factor VIII. Red blood cells, or erythrocytes, are the most abundant cellular element of blood. They function primarily as carriers of oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from respiring cells. Red blood cells are small, flattened, donut-shaped discs. Mature cells lack a nucleus and mitochondria and have few other organelles. This allows for maximum packing of hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying molecule in red blood cells. It is a protein complex consisting of 2 alpha and 2 beta polypeptide chains. In the center of each chain is an iron-containing heme group, which is the binding site for oxygen. Deoxygenated red blood cells are pumped from the heart to the lungs, where they pick up oxygen. This oxygenated blood is returned to the heart, then pumped to all parts of the body. Oxygen is released by the red blood cells into the interstitial fluids surrounding cells in the capillary beds for their use in cellular respiration. Some of the carbon dioxide released during respiration is loaded into the red blood cells. This deoxygenated blood is returned to the heart, then pumped to the lungs, where gas exchange takes place. White blood cells, or leukocytes, comprise about 1% of blood volume. As a group, leukocytes have diverse structure and function. Most important is their role in defending the body against pathogens and in repair of injury. Like red blood cells, leukocytes arise from stem cells in bone marrow. There are 2 major categories of leukocytes, granular and agranular. Granular leukocytes include neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils are the first leukocytes to respond to infection. They engulf foreign cells by phagocytosis. Eosinophils attack parasites such as hookworms, tapeworms, flukes, and pinworms that are too large to be consumed by neutrophils. Clusters of eosinophils surround the parasites and secrete digestive enzymes that attack them. Basophils are involved in inflammatory responses. At wound or injury sites, they release histamines, which stimulate the release of blood plasma from adjacent blood vessels. This response is what causes swelling, itching, and redness associated with inflammation. Agranular leukocytes include monocytes and lymphocytes. Monocytes differentiate into macrophages and body tissues. They engulf foreign invaders and cellular debris. Monocytes also stimulate lymphocytes to fight chronic bacterial and viral infections such as tuberculosis and mononucleosis. Lymphocytes are the main players in the immune response. B lymphocytes, so named because they arise in the bone marrow, are involved in antibody-mediated immunity. They give rise to plasma cells that produce antibodies. T lymphocytes, so named because they arise in the thymus, are involved in cell-mediated immunity.
All right. So that video was pretty detailed. And so we're going to kind of go through all of that and break it down as we kind of go throughout the rest of chapter 7. And so to start off, we're just going to look at the composition of blood and the makeup of blood. Right. So if you went to the hospital or a doctor's office and they took a blood sample, right, and got it in a test tube, that blood sample would be what we would refer to as whole blood. Okay. Now, of that whole blood sample, it would contain plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay. So the plasma makes up 55% of the whole blood. Now, plasma consists of the kind of liquid stuff that's in the body, or in the blood, sorry. And so that's the water with the electrolytes or ions that are dissolved in that water, the proteins, hormones, the various gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then other nutrients and wastes like glucose or urea. And so all of these components are what makes up the plasma, right? So that liquid portion of the blood. Now, the remaining 45% of the whole blood sample is going to be made up of the actual kind of cells, right, that are in the whole blood. So that's the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and the platelets. Now, the red blood cells actually make up about 44% of the whole blood. White blood cells and platelets are about 1%. Okay? So you got 55% of plasma, which is all of these, substances here, water, gases, hormones, etc. Then you have 44%, that's red blood cells, and then 1% is white blood cells and platelets. Okay? So this figure kind of shows that relationship. So here would be a whole blood sample. Right? So this would be, if a nurse took your blood in a test tube and was ready to send it to a lab. Right? All of the plasma and the cells are mixed together. Now, what we can do is we can take that blood sample and we can put it in this machine, which is called a centrifuge. And basically what this centrifuge does is it spins those samples at a very fast RPM. So a high rotation per minute. So it's like thousands of RPMs per minute. And what that will do is it will cause the different elements of the blood to settle based off of kind of the densities, right? So your larger red blood cells will settle at the bottom. The platelets and the white blood cells will settle in the middle. And then your plasma, which is mainly water and ions and molecules, will settle on the top. And so when you centrifuge down this whole blood sample, you actually can see those three distinct components in that blood sample. If we were doing labs in person, you would actually centrifuge down some synthetic sheep's blood, and you would be able to kind of see the different plasma, platelets, and red blood cells, and you would actually measure what's known as the hematocrit. We'll talk about that here in a second. And we would do that via a centrifuge. And so here's a table that comes from your book where it's showing, again, those formed elements, the percentages that they make up, and then the different functions of those different elements. And we're going to continue to talk about these functions of, say, red blood cells, white blood cells, etc., as we move through chapter 7 and chapter 8. So looking at the different components of the whole blood, just kind of summarizing what's in those components and what they do, we're going to start with plasma. Like I mentioned, plasma is the liquid portion of the blood, mostly water, 90% water. The remaining 10% is all of the other stuff. So your hormones, your ions, your molecules like your amino acids, carbohydrates, etc. So that 10% of the plasma is the kind of dissolved stuff in the water. Now, the various proteins that are found in plasma are the albumins and the globulins. And so albumins are really important in maintaining the osmotic balance. And so that cell volume, making sure that the cells don't become too large or shriveled, and that they are isotonic with the surrounding interstitial fluid, or at least being maintained at the appropriate tonicity relative to the surrounding water liquid environment, which is that interstitial fluid with the external fluid, right? And then your globulins are a bunch of different proteins that make up or are made up of alpha, globulins and beta globulins and gamma globulins. Okay? So beta globulins are transport globulins, transport proteins. So for example, some beta globulins will bind to lipid forming proteins like HDL, which is high density lipoproteins, or LDL, which is low density lipoproteins. And this LDL protein is what we would refer to as the bad cholesterol. You don't want high concentrations of this in our bodies. And this is the kind of proteins that tend to cause all of the heart issues and circulatory system issues that's associated with kind of those bad levels of cholesterol. Now, gamma globulins are antibodies that are really important for fighting infections. And we'll talk more about these globulins in a little bit. And then other proteins that are found in the plasma are the clotting proteins, which again help whenever you have an injury, such as a cut or an open wound. And those clotting proteins are there to make sure that we don't lose a lot of blood. And so those clotting proteins help to kind of seal up those wounds before we lose too much blood. Next, looking at red blood cells. So red blood cells, which are also known as erythrocytes, are important for transporting oxygen and transporting carbon dioxide. Red blood cells is about half of the blood volume. So remember, we're looking at about 45%. Okay? If you would look at the volume of blood, that's about 5 million per millimeter cubed of blood. And so again, you're transporting that O2 and that CO2. So O2 to the cells, and then the CO2, which is going to be exhaled, right, during respiration. Now, the red blood cells don't have a nucleus, and they don't have a lot of the other organelles that a regular cell has, and that's because they are packed with a lot of hemoglobin proteins. And these hemoglobin proteins are what carries and transports the oxygen molecules around the body. So the hemoglobin molecules have what's known as these heme groups, and each heme group has one iron atom that the oxygen molecules will bind to. And then the red blood cells will carry them to the appropriate cells, drop that oxygen off, pick up carbon dioxide, and then take it back to the lungs. Red blood cells originate via stem cells in the bone marrow. They exist for about 3 months in humans, so approximately 120 days. Actually, that's 4 months. So about 4 months in humans. And the production of red blood cells, so how many red blood cells your body makes, is driven by the presence of a specific hormone known as erythropoietin. So if you see erythro, right, you're talking about blood, or erythro, that's your red blood cells, right? So cytes is a cell, and then poietin is referring to the hormone. So it's basically the hormone that's responsible for making red blood cells. So this is the typical shape of a red blood cell. So it has that conical shape to it. And if we zoomed into a red blood cell and we look at one kind of hemoglobin molecule, this is what it would look like. So it's 4 different proteins kind of polypeptides put together. And then each one of those has these little heme groups, which is that yellow disc looking structure. And then that little sphere in the middle is an iron atom. And that's what the oxygen would directly bind to. Okay. And now, whenever we were talking about the whole blood earlier, I mentioned the term hematocrit. Okay. And so hematocrit reflects basically the oxygen carrying capacity of the organism whose blood sample you're measuring the hematocrit from. Right, so we could take a sample of your blood, centrifuge it down, and we could measure the hematocrit. And so the hematocrit basically is the percentage of the whole blood that is red blood cells, right? So if we centrifuged it down and looked at just this portion here, that would be the hematocrit, right? And so you can measure that percentage, okay? So the way you would do that is, and you'll see this in your lab exercise on blood, you just won't be able to do it firsthand like I mentioned, but you basically measure the distance, right? So let's say this is 10 centimeters, okay? And then when you spun it down, let's say you measured this distance, and let's say it was, so let's do a different color. Let's say this distance, right, is 4.5 centimeters, okay? And so you would just divide that out, right, over 10, and so you should get like 45%, right, is what that would consist of. Now, whenever you look at hematocrit in humans, your males typically have hematocrit concentrations of about 43 to 49. Women's a little lower, about 37 to 43 on average. And again, that's just red blood cells as a percentage of whole blood. Now, if you measured the hemoglobin that's within those red blood cells, you would get about 14 to 18 or about 12 to 14. So if you have a low hematocrit or hemoglobin concentration relative to these numbers, you may be anemic, right? So you may not be getting enough oxygen to your organs and your other tissues. If you have high hematocrit, it could be response to higher elevation. So maybe you were at a higher elevation for a longer period of time. Your body adapted to that and started making more hematocrit so that you could have more red blood cells to get more oxygen, because the oxygen is at lower concentration in those higher elevations. But if you get really high hematocrit, basically what that means is a higher proportion of your blood is now red blood cells, and a lower proportion is the plasma, which is the watery solution. And so that means your blood is going to be more viscous, and viscous, high viscosity is, think of like molasses versus water. Molasses has a high viscosity, so it kind of flows slower, it's thicker compared to water. And so the more hematocrit you have, the more viscous your blood is, and the harder your heart has to pump in order to push that viscous blood throughout the body. Okay. All right. And so next we're going to look at where blood cells and platelets originate from. And so all blood cells and platelets come from a stem cell. And the stem cell specifically is developed in the bone marrow. And depending on what kind of cells the body needs at that time, the stem cell can be made into either red blood cells or white blood cells or platelets. Okay? And so the stem cells can make all of these types of blood, again, depending on the circumstances that are necessary. Okay? So for example, you have your stem cell in your red bone marrow, right? Remember that red bone marrow is in the ends of the bones, in the epiphyseal area. And that stem cell can develop into a erythroblast. And remember, we said blasts are these immature cells, right? So since it's erythro, that means it's a red blood cell. So it's going to develop into a red blood cell, which is a cyte, right? Remember, a cyte is a mature cell. So erythrocyte. And during that process, the nucleus is lost, as well as a lot of the other organelles. And then you have your stem cells that can develop into these myeloblasts or monoblasts or lymphoblasts. Okay? Myeloblasts will develop into one of the three granular leukocytes. Okay? Your mono will develop into the monocyte, and the lympho will develop into the lymphocyte. And those are your agranular leukocytes. And all of those, so those five, right, are your white blood cells. Now, a stem cell can also develop into a megakaryoblast, which will develop into a megakaryocyte, and then that megakaryocyte will fragment itself into platelets. So platelets are fragments of this larger cell. Okay, and those platelets again are what's found in that 1%, right? So the white blood cell and the platelets. Okay. All right, and when we look at red blood cells, they have a relatively short lifespan compared to other cells. So like we mentioned, those immature red blood cells are erythroblasts. They are made into erythrocytes. They lose their nucleus and organelles as they mature into those erythrocytes. And the average erythrocyte will live about 120 days. Okay. When those red blood cells have aged out and are not working or functioning appropriately anymore, they'll be broken down by macrophages in the liver and spleen, and then their components, the waste, will either be gotten rid of from the body, or other portions like the iron and amino acids from the hemoglobin proteins are recycled and reused in the body. The heme group itself, so what the iron was bound to, is actually converted into bilirubin, and that bilirubin will be discarded through the digestive tract. And so the bilirubin is a product of your red blood cells being broken down. Now, if you have too much bilirubin in your system, your skin and the whites of your eyes will look yellow, and that condition is referred to as jaundice. And it could be associated with a serious liver condition. And because your liver, right, is where this is broken down, the red blood cells are broken down, and it's responsible for kind of getting rid of that bilirubin. It could mean that your liver is diseased, or you may have hepatitis or liver cancer or something along those lines that's leading to kind of the jaundice condition. Okay. Now, the presence of red blood cells is regulated through a negative feedback system. And we already talked about the hormone that regulates that, and it's that erythropoietin hormone. So we refer to that as EPO. Okay? So basically, there are cells in our kidney that regulate the amount of oxygen that's in our bodies. So if the kidneys detect that there are low levels of oxygen, erythropoietin will be released, and that EPO will tell the bones that the stem cells need to increase the production of red blood cells. And so that will bring the oxygen level concentrations in the blood back up, because you have more red blood cells. So that means more oxygen should be traveling throughout the circulatory system. Now, in some cases, you can get kidney disease, specific kidney disease, or certain kidney diseases where EPO is not being secreted like it should in response to those low oxygen levels. And so that hormone needs to be supplemented through some sort of medication. Okay? Athletes have been known to abuse kind of this synthetic EPO by injecting it, making their body produce more red blood cells so that they can get more oxygen to their muscles, so that maybe they could, say, run for longer periods of time and not kind of gas out during their sport or activity. Big downside to this is that they are making their blood more viscous, making their heart work harder, and that could lead to serious issues with overworking your heart. So here's a figure just kind of showing that negative feedback. So you have the set point for your oxygen. When it gets below that set point, your kidneys will determine that. It will tell the body to release the EPO. That EPO will say, okay, we need to make more red blood cells. So the red blood cells will increase, and then the oxygen will go back up to that set point because of the increase in red blood cell concentrations. Now, looking at our white blood cells are very important for defending the body. Okay? And again, these white blood cells come from stem cells in that red bone marrow. They make up approximately 1% of the whole blood. So them, along with platelets, right, make up that 1%. So again, protection from infection, helps to respond to inflammatory reactions. And like that animation said, and like we showed earlier, we can divide white blood cells into two categories, granular and agranular. So granular cells have the little, they look like grains, right? Kind of dots of structures that are inside of those cells. And agranular, you don't see those. Okay? White blood cells have a pretty short lifespan as well. And but so even though they have a short lifespan, the body can increase the concentration of white blood cells in the bloodstream relatively quickly whenever the body senses or detects some sort of infection, right? And it will release kind of the appropriate white blood cells in response to that. And so looking at these two categories, the granular leukocytes are made up of three different types of white blood cells. So you have your neutrophils, your eosinophils, and then your basophils. Okay, so the neutrophils are the ones that will engulf foreign invaders. All right, so they're one of the first ones to kind of get to that infection site. And they actually make up a really large portion of the white blood cell that are in our whole blood. Right, so you have 1% of your whole blood that are white blood cells. Of that 1%, 60% of them are neutrophils. The other big white blood cell is the lymphocytes, which we'll talk about in the next slide, which is part of the agranular leukocytes. So neutrophils, 60% of the white blood cells, first to really come to the scene of infection and engulf those microorganisms to try to get rid of them. Eosinophils are between 2 and 4% of that white blood cell concentration, and they're really important for defending against those larger parasites. So they're the ones that kind of surround those parasites, release enzymes to break them down, and they help with allergic reactions as well. Basophils are really low in terms of their concentration associated with the other white blood cells, only about 0.5%. And they're what releases the histamines into our blood to help with inflammation and our allergic reactions. And they kind of help regulate those processes. Agranular leukocytes, which are the second category of white blood cells, consist of two different cells, so monocytes and lymphocytes. Okay? Monocytes make up about 5% of that total 1%, right, of white blood cells. And they actually leave the blood and transform into macrophages that will then go around and take up different components, cellular components in the body, and break down those cellular components. The other agranular leukocyte are lymphocytes. Okay? This is the second highest white blood cell, second to the neutrophils, which is at 60%. So lymphocytes are 30%. So together, the neutrophils and the lymphocytes make up, 90% of the white blood cells. Okay. The other 10% are sorry if that was loud, dropped my microphone. The other 10% are the monocytes, the eosinophils, and basophils. Now, your lymphocytes are very important for immune responses. We have two different lymphocytes, which are the B lymphocytes, again, which come from bone, and then the T lymphocytes, which come from the thyroid. All right, and so the last part of, or the last component of blood are the platelets, which, like we mentioned, is really important for blood clotting. So you have those megakaryocytes that come from stem cells, and then they break down into fragments, which are the platelets. And the platelets are really important for clotting, so they initiate the clotting process, and they help get that started. And then along with other clotting proteins, they will make a clot and seal that damaged blood vessel so that we don't lose a lot of blood in the process. All right, and so that's the overview for the blood. That's the end of the first video. For the second video, we're going to continue talking about blood. We'll talk about homeostasis, so basically how our bodies can stop blood. We'll talk about blood types, and then we'll finish up with diseases that can affect our blood. And so with that, we'll see you in the second video.